Jabril Robinson was murdered May 16, 2016 in Clayton County, Georgia. Officer Charlie McDaniel radioed for backup, in which Dwayne Parkins was dispatched to the scene. Once Dwayne Parkins arrived on the scene, he came in contact with my son and immediately shot him in the back of his head.
Harry Baxter Jr. was killed by Oakland police on January the 16th, 2011. He ran up the street, and the neighbors of seeing him run up both streets, and they said he was zigzagging, and they were and there was a guy chasing him and shooting at him, and he hit him in the back with a bullet, and Kerry fell to the ground.
Marquise Jones was killed by San Antonio police. On that day, I was getting ready for work, and I saw there was a shooting at Chacho's and Chaluchi's around 5 in the morning. And I remember saying they need to close their restaurant down because it is always someone being killed there. There's always fights there, always this. And I see the yellow chalk tarp, and I say, Lord, bless their family. I could hear my sister crying, who is Marquise's son, saying they killed him. I remembering I could not breathe. I could not catch my breath.
Jacob Dominguez was murdered by San Jose Police Department on September 15, 2017. Officer Michael Pena, part of a covert response unit, on unmarked cars, no sirens, no lights, plainclothes officers boxed in Jacob, killing him within 20 seconds of having him contained. No de-escalation. After he was dead, they put in the canine to maul up his throat.
My name is Monty Benjamin, the mother of Javis Benjamin, who was killed by Officer Lynn Thomas of the Avondale State Police Department on January 18, 2013. Javis was not looking in the direction of Officer Thomas. He was engaging with the people in the community. Officer Thomas began to move backwards. Javis then looked in his direction. At this time, Officer Thomas then shot Javis twice, once in the heart and the other in the lower abdomen with his hands raised.
My name is Adrienne Hood, the mother of Henry Green V, who was killed by 2 plainclothes police officers here in Columbus, Ohio, June 6 of 2016. Many of the witnesses that were outside said that the officers never identified themselves. They jumped out the vehicle, all while firing at my son. My son, Henry, was shot 8 times from a total of 22 bullets that were fired at him. And he lay on the sidewalk and took his last breaths.
My name is Janet Baker. My son was heinously murdered by someone who was supposed to serve and protect him. When I wake up in the morning, my son is the first thing on my mind. When I go to bed at night, I labor. Did I do the right things? Did I make the right calls? Did I align myself with the right groups? Did I speak out for justice enough? Or did I say the wrong things? Did I somehow hinder getting justice for it?
My name is Geraldine Brown Bluford, the mother of Alan Dwayne Bluford, who was killed by Oakland Police Department officer Miguel Masso on May the 6th of 2012. Alan, who was not under arrest, not read any Miranda rights, began to leave. As he was walking away from the scene, the police officer turned off his lapel camera and began to chase Alan. Alan was running, according to witness statements, yelling, "I didn't do anything." The officer took out his weapon, shooting himself in the foot. Alan heard the gunshot and fell to the ground with hands up. According to witness statements, the police officer walked over to Alan as he was lying on the ground and shot him in his chest 3 times.
My name is Sheila Banks, the godmother and auntie of Corey Jones that was killed by Newman Roger, October 18, 2015. Police officer Newman Roger approached him, and within a few seconds or so, Corey was running for his life. He was shot at 6 times. He was hit 3 times. And boy, I tell you, our lives have never been the same.
My name is Kathy Scott Lights, mother of Jarvis Lights, who was killed by a Georgia State Trooper on December 29, 2017. They stated that Jarvis exited his vehicle. There was no body cam or dash cam to confirm this statement. It was reported that Jarvis attempted to return back to his car when Officer Nolan attacked him from the back of his body. Jarvis came back up out of his car after he found what he was searching for with his arms raised in the air. State Trooper Nolan stated that he didn't know what that object was in Jarvis' hand, and he shot Jarvis in his right upper shoulder arm. And the object that was in Jarvis' hand was his cell phone, which was found next to his body after he had been shot on the ground, bleeding out.
Welcome, everyone, to Voices of Struggle and Hope. Mothers Speak Out on Police Brutality. This is the third of 10 dialogues with mothers from 10 different cities, women who have suffered the loss of a child to deadly police violence. Mothers Against Police Brutality is producing these programs, which will be held at 12 noon and 7 p.m. all this week. I'm John Fullenwider, a longtime human rights activist in Dallas. Colette Flanagan, who is the founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality, and I will be moderating the programs. Mothers Against Police Brutality was founded by Colette in 2013 after her son, Clinton Allen, was killed by the Dallas police. Clinton was 25 years old, father of twin boys, and he was unarmed in March of 2013 when a Dallas police officer killed him. He was shot 7 times, once in his upper arm, as if it were being raised, 5 times in the chest, and once at close range in the back. The officer who killed Clinton was never held accountable in any form. No indictment, no trial, no punishment of any kind. In fact, he's still on the Dallas police force today. Colette asked myself and another activist, Sarah Mokuria, who had lost her own father to the Dallas police as a child. She asked us to help her start Mothers Against Police Brutality. MAPB has been working the past couple of years on 2 major initiatives. The first is to take the crisis of deadly police violence to the United Nations. This has happened through a number of forums that we've participated in 20 and 21. And Colette was just in Geneva last month addressing the United Nations Human Rights Council on the killings of, particularly of Black people and other people of color by police in the United States. Our second major initiative is the Mothers Against Police Brutality Legacy Fellowship Program. This is a program operating in 10 cities. We had about 150 applicants for the fellowships, and it's difficult to choose among them. But the women who were chosen have been strong advocates for their children after they were killed by the police, and effective community organizers in their own hometowns. And through the fellowship, we are supporting them in their work locally and trying to help them extend their network of contacts and gain some new experiences and skills that we know and we hope will make them leaders in the broader national movement to change policing. And in particular, in MAPB's plan to create a national network among families with the direct experience of police brutality centered on the moms. And that brings us to Adrienne Hood, who is one of the MAPB fellows and a very effective organizer there in Ohio. Thanks for being with us this morning, Adrienne.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for all that you're doing and for having me.
We appreciate it. We're also joined by two distinguished panelists today. The first one I'm going to introduce is Reverend Derek Holmes. He is an author and a lecturer and contributing editor to the Columbus African American News Journal. He's a licensed Christian counselor, working with local groups there, local community organizations in various struggles for equality and justice. And he is a faith organizer with the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, helping congregations to become more active in the work of liberation of people of color. Pastor Holmes, thank you so much for joining us. Talk to us briefly about the Ohio Organizing Collaborative and what you call the politics of disruption.
Well, first, John, I appreciate that gracious introduction. I don't know if I'm as good as that bio, but anything that is good, then to God be the glory. Pleasure to be able to share with you all, Sister Adrienne, just Colette, just being able to share space. I really appreciate the opportunity to dialogue. The Ohio Organizing Collaborative is the largest organizing faction in the state of Ohio. It's been around since 2010. Started in Cincinnati, Ohio, with the purpose of organizing communities that are disenfranchised to address systemic inequity, organize them to push toward equitable rights in whatever context that looks like. So whether that's in the faith community, whether that's with mothers looking for equal wage, whether that's addressing redistricting, which is a huge issue here in the state, and in particular, police brutality, as it were here. So we organize in those different silos. That way. When I think about the politics of disruption, it's clear to me. I think liberation happens on levels. And I think when you just concentrate on doing just one thing, that we don't get the results that are required for everybody to live what I consider to be an equitable lifestyle. And that means that there not only needs to be efforts to address things in terms of politics, in terms of controlling resources, in terms of being organized and strategic about the battles that we choose, thinking down the road. But there also has to be a healthy sense of agitation. This country was founded under the notion that there were a group of people who felt a way about the powers in place and weren't polite when it came to disrupting in order to make the world into what they wanted it to be. And so when I think about the politics of disruption, what I mean by that is the notion that there needs to be healthy agitation. If you were sick right now and you sneezed, I would be wrong and insensitive if I told you that you sneezed too loud, right? Because your suffering has to have a place to speak. It has to have a place to be able to be voiced and be lifted in whatever way that sounds. And when you do that rightly, it forces those in power, it forces those in control to address their function. So I see the politics of disruption, being able to disrupt and agitate and organize and protest and to defend what it is, to not let it be marginalized or pushed down into spaces where it's seen as something ignorant. But being very strategic and intentional around it, I think that it's a necessary wedge in terms of moving towards liberation.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We are going to be joined in just a moment by Cheryl Smith, who's the leader in journalism here in Dallas, in the Dallas area and nationally. And once she gets hooked in, I'll introduce her. But we want today, we want to reflect upon the crisis in policing and the use of deadly force. And we want to do that by a careful, careful, I guess would be right, but a deep response to what happened to Adrienne Hood and her son, Henry Green V. And I wonder, Adrienne, if we could start us off just by telling us about Henry, the kind of person he was.
Yeah. So Henry is my oldest son. I have one daughter and two boys. And Henry is the oldest. He is the fifth. So that's a legacy that was torn away from us. But Henry's personality is, I call him my under the radar guy. He, he can be in the space and interact, or he cannot and just, sit back and stay to himself. But he was definitely our funny guy. When we could count on the jokes, we knew they were going to be coming from him most of the time. My other two are funny, but I have to crown Henry. And if I say Bub, that is who I am referring to, because not until he was murdered and taken away from us have I used Henry so much. We have always called him Bubby, which is a name that his sister gave him. But he was funny. He was smart. He was definitely a protector to his family. I did raise them for the most part by myself, or as a single mom, not by myself, because I had community. But nonetheless, he definitely took on the big brother role. Even though my daughter is older than him, he was the big brother still. And they're only 18 months apart. But Henry is funny. He didn't have any children, and he just lights up spaces, and so that is definitely very much missed with him not being here. But if I had to sum him up in a couple of words, I would say that he was funny, he is courageous, and he is our protector.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We always want to center our discussions on the actual lived experience of families that go through this. And then we also want to lift up the full humanity of a person that gets killed in official action. I know that you probably didn't even recognize Henry when the first news reports came out saying who he was and so forth. And it's a common experience and a hurtful one for families to see their loved ones vilified as they try to dehumanize them and make it seem like, well, they must have been doing something wrong to run up against the police like this. The next thing I'm going to ask you, Adrienne, is not easy. I know no matter how many times you tell this story, that it's going to be painful. But could you take us back to that day in June in 2016 and tell us what happened to Henry Green V?
Yeah, and it really ties in to what you were just saying, John, about how the community will, just accept the narrative that is given immediately. But contrary to what people have heard and seen, Henry was really minding his own business, walking in his own community with one of his friends back to my sister's house when he crossed paths with these two individuals who were plainclothes in an unmarked vehicle with Florida tags, who were on a summer initiative called the Summer Safety Initiative for quote unquote high crime areas. And so they are there to observe, right? But this particular day, they decided to do more than observe. They decided to encounter and engage my son. And so while Henry was walking back to my sister's house with his friend, as they were getting ready to cross this first intersection of contact, they almost hit him with their SUV. And so the officers report that my son said something smart to them. And this started an entire engagement. There was the allegation that my son pointed his gun at them as they were going by, although one officer who was in the back seat never seen any of it, even though his partner had told him that someone had just pointed a gun at them. He never looked. He never seen anything that his partner was saying. And when we were questioning them about it, he said that he wasn't the one that called it in because he could not see the color of my son's socks and shoes. I've never seen that happen before. But nonetheless, Henry continued to proceed to the next street, which is the street that my sister lived on. And at this time, the officers continued down the street that they were on because at that particular time, all of the streets were one ways. So they went around, called for a car, but for whatever reason chose not to wait for the car and engaged my son again. There were plenty of witnesses that were outside at this particular time. There were children that were outside playing in the yard. And when Bubby got ready to cross this particular intersection, this SUV again comes up the street at a high rate of speed with their guns drawn, or the driver with his gun drawn, and he shot at my son. And at that point, Henry returned fire at these two officers who are out of the vehicle at this point and shooting, in essence, shooting up our neighborhood. Because again, there were yards of children playing. At the end of it, these officers fired 23 shots at my son. 8 of those bullets hit my son, and unfortunately, him dying on the sidewalk. Although they did take him to the hospital and claim that he died there. But I was able to see a video that unfortunately someone decided to live stream the incident. And I know my child, and I seen his life leave him on that sidewalk on that day. The initial reports from the media as they interviewed the police department were that suspect, which we never found out what he was a suspect of, was standing on a corner brandishing a weapon. I asked them, is that illegal in a state? Even if I went with your narrative, would that be illegal in a state that's an open carry state? If he was standing there minding his own business with his weapon. It did not take long for the community to
react and respond to the narrative that the police were putting out there. People started contacting our family members almost immediately and letting us know, what had happened and that their story was not true. It has definitely been an uphill battle from the onset. The first detective that I spoke to within 5 minutes of sitting down and talking to him said that he realized that my son was not a felon, as if that would justify his officers gunning my son down as if he was less than a human being. And so, like I said, it has definitely been an uphill battle from that night, from us going to the hospital, them asking me, how did I know that it was my son? I told them, if you let me see him, I can tell you that he was my son, but your coworkers are the ones that told me to come to the hospital because this is where my son was. And at that point, the doctor dropped his head and the detective told me that he could not let me see my son because my son was evidence. So I never got to touch him warm again. The next time that I seen him was at the funeral home. The degrading, the dehumanizing treatment that any family that finds themselves in this situation is subjected to, that's inhumane. That's the inhumane part, is for us to be treated as if our loved ones are less than human. So I definitely appreciate you centering their humanness from the beginning, because that is something that I have promised myself that I would do going forward. I promised myself I'm not here to convince anyone of my son being a human being, but I will always challenge the inhumanity and the degrading treatment that we were subjected to, with being thrust into a space that we did not ask for. I call it the involuntary club because I didn't ask to be here. I don't want to be here still 6 years later, but I know that it's necessary for us to get changes, and so that we can get pieces of accountability, because justice does not exist.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. I see, and I'm sure Pastor Holmes does too, a lot of dimensions in the story of how this happened. And I'll just mention a couple of them. One is that a plainclothes car with Florida plates is not going to be immediately recognized as a police vehicle. And it is true. I've seen a number of cases, and case isn't really the right word, but I've seen a number of police killings where the victim did not even know, or would not even have known, they were facing off against a policeman. And then you bring up, of course, that Ohio is an open carry state. I'm sure if I got at one end of your street and Pastor Holmes got at the other end, and we both walked toward each other with a gun, he'd probably get stopped in 2 steps, and they'd probably let me walk right up there and say, I've got my Second Amendment right,
Absolutely.
And so there's that. And then the multiple shots is common. When a person gets shot, like if we're all in a poker game and somebody stands up and shoots, usually they'll shoot once. twice, maybe. Police officer almost always empties their gun, always. And sometimes they reload and empty it again all the time. They're saying, stop or I'll shoot while they're shooting, you know. So that's a common thing, as horrible as it is every time it happens. And then the third thing is probably the Summer Safety Initiative was probably just an example of hotspot policing, where they just flood an area with cops. And, you know, you usually get a temporary, make some arrests, and you'll get a temporary lull in certain kinds of crime. When you do that, like the robberies of a convenience store, for instance, might go down temporarily. We had one of these kinds of things where they invited the Texas state troopers to come to Dallas a couple of summers ago because we had a high murder rate. And they ended up killing someone themselves and adding to the homicides for the year, you know. And so that is a strategy in policing that is very common. And it's a strategy that you got to admit has any reasonable person would have to admit is a failure. Because when you don't change the conditions in the community, then once the police move to the new hotspot, things come back, you know. And so you have this paradox where you have racial profiling, you have brutality, you have very aggressive policing, and yet the crime rate stays the same, you know, not just for a year, but for our whole life, you know. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, because I can't remember if you've told me before, but how old was Henry?
23.
23. A young Black man. And I'm sure these cops just thought, you know, let's hassle them. They're bound to have something, you know, and it's a terrible attitude to take. And it's one that is all too common, really. You can see it in the statistics. A Black person is more than twice as likely to be killed by police as white, and even unarmed. The number of the percentage of unarmed people killed by the police who are Black is 13%, but for whites it's 7%. And I'm wondering, Pastor Holmes, if you might, in your reflections, talk a little bit about the target that's on the young men of color when they encounter a police officer.
Well, I appreciate your analysis, and I think it's spot on. Before I travel, I do want to just hold space for Sister Hood and I have known each other for a while now, and I consider her to be a chief member of the Sisterhood of the Strong. She mentioned kind of the sorority of suffering that comes out of these moments, and I just want to affirm kind of the strength it takes to do this, to continue to tell that story. I just want to hold space for that. I've heard it before, and it resonates with me in the same way every time. So I just want to honor that. When we talk about the target that's on the back of Black people, in particular Black men, I kind of have to start macro for my thinking. I think there are some truths that we just need to be honest about. Black life is in danger in this country, and we have to be honest about that. We have to be honest about the systems that are in place that do not advantage persons of color. And for me, if we can't be honest about that, then all the other conversations don't make sense. I can say without any equivocation that I've had moments where when you try to have conversations around police brutality, around broken window policing, when you talk about these issues for other people, because they're so immersed in the system, right? It's like banging your head against the wall. It's like asking a fish to understand water. They're just in it, so they can't explain. They don't even know what it is. And so for me, I'm always trying to elevate the conversation to just own that there are systems in place that have historically, it's not a matter of opinion, it's not conjecture, it's a fact, that there are systems in place that have historically been to the disadvantage of Black folk. Chief among those systems is the reality of, police, right? The reality of policing in this country. It has always been, it's a matter of historical record, that it has always been the long arm of the racist apparatus in this country. So racism was enforced by those who were policing. When our ancestors were brought here and had the courage and the audacity to move in freedom and run for it, it was police who were going to enforce that and bring them back to oppression. The truth is, again, it's not a matter of opinion. The truth is that those underpinnings inform the way that policing happens in our communities right now. And I think it's just important to own that. I think it's also important to own that in terms of how our communities are policed, that is the entryway into the larger prison industrial complex, right? So what is it? 1 out of 3 African-American men between the ages of 18 and 35, either in prison, on parole, or on probation. That's a ridiculous statistic, right? And so we just have to own that as the truth, that no matter where you are, no matter what side of town you live on, right? That just by virtue of the way that you're born, and by the way, operating out of those cultural identities. So there are things that we just do that are just inherent to our culture. There are ways that we speak that are just inherent to our culture. If you're doing it right, there's a healthy distance that you have to the systems that are in place, because you know how it affects people. And so this is the part that's really challenging for me, is that you'll have people who will place judgment on folk for how they are trying to figure out how to exist every day under an empire that disenfranchises them, but then penalize them for the ways in which they choose to survive, right? And this goes to your point around the way in which things are policed. So don't police my neighborhood that's poverty stricken without addressing the poverty. And that inverted accountability is what plays out. And sis, I'm gonna talk to it, and you can text me later and tell me if I went too far, but it's worth saying. It's the truth. When Bub was murdered, there were 3 insults that happened behind that. The first was the obvious loss of life. The second one was the public treatment of blame and shame towards Adrienne and her family. I'm a pastor, so I get to be in a lot of these circles in a lot of rooms, and I don't enjoy a lot of them. Sometimes I'm just there just to hear what people say and to pay attention to who's quiet. And when that happened, the number of people who said, oh, well, if she was a better parent, if he wasn't where he was, if he wasn't doing this, if he didn't dress like this, if he didn't look like this, if he didn't act like this, the truth is that there are people in this country who make decisions around where they go, how they look, how they talk, and they get to make it home every single day. They don't have to be privy to that type of violence, to that type of risk. And by the way, when you know that you're being surveilled, which is very much the culture that we live in now, when you know you're being surveilled, you look even more suspicious, right? Because you're afraid that something's going to happen. Your head is on a swivel. You get tense when law enforcement comes around, and that inverted accountability that didn't go to law enforcement, but that Sister Adrienne, that her family had to deal with publicly, with nobody that professed to be on her side, very little, who professed to be on her side, to stand in opposition of it, while none of that accountability went to the officer. It didn't go to the CPD. It didn't go to the Fraternal Order of Police. None of that accountability, but it was perfectly fine for a bunch of people, even in newspapers, to insinuate that if she just would have been a little bit better of a person, then somehow this murder wouldn't have happened. So there's the insult of loss. There's the insult of that inverted accountability, right? And then the worst insult is that the officer still gets to remain on duty. There's no conviction, right? So then that person gets to police their same community or in their same city, right? And now what that creates is policing through intimidation. What that is now is 21st century lynching. So now there's an example made, and there's this nonverbal statement that's suggested that says that you saw what we did here. So now you have to move differently. And I think unless we're able to have the conversation in that way, then it's non-productive, because now we know what we have to dismantle. We have to begin to reimagine the way that we think about policing. What does it mean and let me own my bias. I think that across the country, there are too many police. I think that I live in Columbus, Ohio. There are a billion suburbs that are here, whether it's Hilliard, whether it's Upper Arlington, whether it's Dublin, whether it's Gahanna. If you look at statistically the number of police that is in those communities, it's very minimal. But in Linden, in the short north, on the south side, on the east side, where the majority of folk are persons of color, poor folk, over policing happens. So I think we could actually just dial that down. It is a matter of data. The Department of Justice says that over policing or policing a community does not lead to a decrease in crime.
Sure it doesn't.
Right. So what does it mean when something happens to have somebody show up that maybe doesn't have a gun? If poverty is a mental health crisis, here's where my counseling comes in. If poverty has a mental effect, right, what does it mean to have a licensed professional show up to address some of those issues? Because a lot of them aren't necessarily violent. It's just someone reacting to the condition that they don't feel like they can change. So I think when we start macro and just own these as truths and don't make time for the silly arguments, right? You can't tell me that there was something justifiable where this person lost their life without doing anything. So let's elevate the conversation. These are the systems that are in place that are continually marginalizing and murderously marginalizing our people. This is how we address them, right? This is what we have to tear down. I think when we do that, it's more productive. And I think the opposite of that is just finding new ways to have the same problem.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that happens that in my experience working with families is that sometimes this encounter will just explode a family in a way and tear them apart, and they'll retreat, you know. And at other times, like in the case of Henry's family, this horrible tragedy or crime will awaken a passion for justice that does not let up. And Adrienne, I know you led the family through the whole grand jury process, and there was no accountability there. And I know you led the family through 2 wrongful death suits. And talk about that a little bit, about how this kind of crime ripples through both the near future and then here we are almost 7 years out.
Yeah, so there was a lot of things that I did not know. Obviously, before coming into this space, almost instantly, when I was demanding an independent investigation and reached out to the Ohio Attorney General's office, I learned about home rule and that Ohio was a home rule state. And so when the young man explained to me that home rule meant if CPD did not invite somebody into their home to assist or do the investigation, no one could just come and interject themselves into that space. And that was hard for me to process and understand, you know, at first. But it also, it like you said, it awakened something in me because I don't like bullies. I don't care what arena they're in. I don't like them. And I felt like this was a way that the system was bullying my community. And so when I learned about that, you know, I started like pressing the issue of we need to take officer involved shootings out of the police department. That was when I learned it, that was one of my first asks, you know, going forward. Would it be helpful for me and my family? Not necessarily, because I knew that the people that were in charge and are still in charge in many of the in many other instances, we're not going to do that willingly, because the political landscape around here is just that, right? And so you don't want to ruffle too many feathers because you want to get reelected. And so so that was one barrier that we came up against. The grand jury process was a whole another beast. To learn that the process was secret, to learn that there would be nobody to speak on Bub's behalf besides myself, not even realizing that there were and there are some mothers who never got the opportunity to speak in front of the grand jury. They got a phone call later that there was no indictment. So I take issue with that, and we'll be looking, for things to change in that arena as well. And so then we get to almost 6 years later, 5.5 years later, we started, because it was last November, actually about this time last year, that we had the first trial in the wrongful death that ended in a hung jury. To go into that space and understand again that we're at a crossroads with the jury selection and the whole process of how they're selected. And I kept saying to my attorneys and even to the judge, how is it that these pools are still coming up predominantly white, almost all rural or suburbs, and we're pulling from the voter registration, and we still don't see diversity in the jury process on either the criminal nor the civil side? That's intentional.
Yeah.
That is intentional. And so, as you know, we went through again in April with another jury that was more conservative than the first. And I think the judge, I don't even know how to put that part together. There was one Black person on each of the juries. So I guess, they can say that there was an attempt made, right? And I don't say that as if it was an all Black jury or a majority Black jury or Black and brown jury, that the outcome would have been different. That's not what I'm saying. But the intentionality that goes into ensuring that there's not a balance in the jury pool, that's a problem. And it's another systemic issue, right, that Reverend Holmes talked about. So we went through that and learning the cases that are the barriers to families getting anything, any type of accountability, because I just have a hard time using justice, because justice would be me not even being here and having this conversation, because I would have my son. So accountability is something that we deserve. And I will continue, like you said, John, there are some mothers who they just cannot. Mentally, they just cannot. And I feel like that's one of my reasons and purposes for being in this space. They can't, so I will. And I will give it all that I have, not just for the moms that are in the space already, but I will give it all that I have to keep moms from even having to be a part.
Thank you for that. And thanks for all you've done. Before we were even thought up the fellowship program, I had read about your work in Columbus and throughout the state there, and knew of it. One of the cases I know that you filed was the doctrine of qualified immunity was a real barrier to getting to trial usually. And this is a doctrine, this wouldn't be a systemic change, I guess, Pastor Holmes, but this would be a substantive incremental change. There's three ways for a family to seek accountability after this crime has happened to them. And the first is criminal liability for the cops that were involved, officer involved shooting. And a lot of times the grand jury thing is pretty quick. Some district attorneys don't even investigate the case themselves separately. They just take the folder, the jacket, as they call it, from the police department and a quick fact check, and that's it. And I know that you may have heard the phrase that a district attorney could indict a ham sandwich if they wanted to. And yet they seem to be just helping to bring an indictment against police officers in this country. The second way a family will seek accountability is in civil litigation, filing a wrongful death suit, as you did. Very difficult process. It's usually really protracted, takes a big toll on the family. It's hard for attorneys to win those cases. And one of the reasons it's so hard is this doctrine of qualified immunity. And I won't bore everybody with the details of it, but this is a doctrine that's supposed to protect a public servant in the honorable discharge of their duties, so that they're not frivolously sued for stuff. And but it's become the way they apply it is in each circuit. Like if I'm a federal judge in a certain circuit, if there's not a precedent that's almost the exact same case of factual base, and that was found to be not eligible for qualified immunity, in other words, a conviction was got, or if there's not a case, if there's not a precedent, then qualified immunity is almost the knee-jerk response. And you can bet that the police file for it a lot of time, many times, and they sometimes you never really even get to trial sometimes, because they just dismiss it on a motion for dismissal based on qualified immunity. So this is a doctrine that there's a national coalition to end qualified immunity that people can find if they go online. But qualified immunity was so important to law enforcement to protect cops who kill that it was really the hangup almost in the George Floyd Act in the Senate. They talked about qualified immunity. Was Tim Scott and Cory Booker were negotiating, and that was a hangup, and it ended up being the part of the law that killed the whole law. So it's very difficult, and it's not well known. It's known among people who've suffered from it, among activists and lawyers, but it's not well known to the general public. And then the third way that a family can seek accountability is the last thing you said, and that is through policy change, through movement building, through changing policing, and through changing the conditions that allow the police to basically run wild in some communities. And these changes are very difficult, and it's not for the faint of heart. It's a long-term thing. One of the ways I try to think about this is a transformational change and an incremental change. And I'm going to just suggest one kind of incremental change, and then maybe y'all have some ideas on that, and then we can discuss further transformational change. But suppose that cops that were working traffic weren't armed. You're working, like here, there's a speed trap on Ferguson Road in East Dallas. They don't need to be armed to work that speed trap, and that way they can't so quickly escalate, getting out of their car with their gun drawn and so forth. And if it looks like you're gonna the situation is going to escalate, you're not armed. You just toss them the ticket and get back and leave. You know, when you look at a death in custody report, it usually has a thing, an item that says, what's the highest crime this person could have been charged with? And usually it's like, it's certainly not a capital offense, you know? And so just to just keep it like a meter maid, you know, downtown that's giving you a parking ticket. And, you know, if you're a cop, you're going to keep your eyes and ears open. And if you come across a car that just came from a bank robbery, they're armed to the teeth, you know, that never happens. But if it did, you call it in, you know, and then that's one. And then not doing high-speed chases, that's one. Officer killed in a high-speed chase here locally yesterday, and he crashed his own car into a telephone pole. You know, high-speed chase endangers everybody. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. What are some of the things that, you know, would prevent maybe have a good chance of preventing the encounter from escalating to what really is an execution? What do you think?
I love what you're talking about around this. I think about it maybe in two ways, right? So one, I agree with you. There are some things that aren't as high level that could yield results in our community, right? I don't think you should police a community you don't live in. That's an easy fix, relatively speaking, right? Because then that suggests that if you want someone to police a community, then you start putting resources in that community to where they understand what effective policing is. And then, right, so then you kind of set the bar, and then you create it so that way it'll feed it. So, and I think that's an example of what you're talking about too. But I also think there's an opportunity for us, and I don't want to sound pessimistic because I'm not. I purport to be a Christian. I always come down on the side of hope, but I also know that hope and optimism aren't the same thing, right? So I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful. And because I'm not optimistic, I think with the moment that we're in, the responsible thing to do is for us to start navigating our communities to create the accountability that we want to see. And sis, I appreciate you saying that too, because when you were talking about not necessarily wanting to use justice and talking about accountability, I appreciate that, because the way that I understand restorative justice is that it lends to accountability, right? So you can't fix this egregious thing that happened, right? But the thing that at least points toward wholeness is some accountability, right? That's at the bedrock of maybe what restorative justice is fundamentally. And I think in terms of our community, and this is why I appreciate the work that you're doing, and when I see organizers and activists out here on the street, it matters as much, because what does it look like to just know that there are targets on our back, that our communities are treated a certain way, and that the problem isn't going to be fixed anytime soon. So when our babies are out, we need to be out with our babies, right? We need to be watching with what does it mean if someone radios something in to where we create the network to where someone else shows up and is just there to keep kind of like the peacemaker model, but also navigating that type of accountability, right? We're surveilling the surveillors, right? Because some of these other things, and here's where I think we get it wrong. I think we do right to consider implementing things in process that lend towards accountability, but I don't know if we're always doing the work. I think we claim those wins without doing the work to then force it. So it makes no sense to talk about a body cam. We fought for body cameras for years here in Columbus, right? And then a murder happened just a couple months ago, and it was on camera, and there's no accountability. The same cycle happens over and over again. Forget the body camera. What if there were 5 more people that were outside that knew that the police were showing up, right? Or knew that when them boys were there, that they're just watching to make sure that something appropriate's happening, that this doesn't end in a murderous way. And then building our activism out of that, because you can't tell people constitutionally how to be in their community. You can't tell people they can't go outside. We're not a police state. right? So, right, so you
Feels
can't
like it sometimes.
right, theoretically, we're not a police state, right? You can't tell people when to be outside, when not to be outside, what they can and can't do. You can't do that. In fact, the moments when that happens, that's actually unlawful, which means what? That in our communities, we also need to be empowering people with information too. Because most of the time there are all types of things that are happening that are against process, that are just wrong. And then we just don't know it because we're intimidated, and most of us are just trying to make it home.
Yeah.
But what does it mean? So I agree with you, and I think you're right that there are things, it's not low-hanging fruit. That's not the term I want to use. I agree with you that there are easier wins, right, that can lend to meaningful change in our community. But I absolutely believe, I mean this with every fiber of my being, I don't believe in asking anybody for anything I can do myself. And I think in the Black community, there is very little that we can't do for ourselves. And I'm not looking for a system or a government or some well-intentioned person. I think that we can do it ourselves. And I think when it happens on both ends, I think it can be a both and. And I think when we're doing that, I think we'll see a more safe type of change. I feel really strongly about that, because I'm less likely to do something crazy if I know somebody's looking. That's the trick. That's the trick of the oppression, right? If I know that someone there is going to hold me accountable, whether the legislator does or not, right? Whether the mayor does or not, whether the police chief does or not, if I know that there are people in the community that are watching this happen and are going to hold me accountable for it, I'm going to get in the cruiser and leave. Right? That's what I'm going to get in the cruiser and leave. I might come back tomorrow, but we'll be there tomorrow too. And so I think organizing our community matters too.
Oh, I think it's the base of everything for trying to change. Yeah. Adrienne, I wonder if you would, one of the things that really resonated when we were first talking earlier in the program was the way that the family was treated after the shooting, after the crime, like not being able to see the body. I mean, this is like one of the worst things. And just in the dialogue yesterday, we had the same thing happen. And I've seen that here. I've seen a family that can't even get to see the autopsy of their own child. You know, what are some of the things that you think about after going through this that would be helpful to a family? I mean, I know it's the case that they don't usually help at all. Like if they kick your door in, they don't come back and fix the door the next day, you know, and this is even much worse. But are there things that would help families in the aftermath, that, you know, a protocol or something like that?
So there's a lot. There's a lot, you know, because you don't know what to do. You don't know where to turn. And depending on your case and the quote unquote easiness or difficulty of your case, you may not even get legal assistance. And then you have to navigate that space, you know, on your own. I know, you know, mothers in that situation where there are attorneys that won't touch their case, not because there isn't a case, but because of the work that it's going to take in order to bring that case to fruition, right? But in that struggle, they're also working up against a clock. And that clock starts the time that your child is stolen, right? And so, like here, and I'm sure, you know, across the country, different organizations are doing the things, but I know for Ohio Families, because I also sit on the board for Ohio Families Unite Against Police Brutality. And one of the things that we try to make sure that we do is inform the families of this is what you can expect and in this order. Here's the timeline that you're going to be working with. Depending on what city it is, we have recommendations, for lawyers or for contact people in that community for them. Because all of that becomes vital. It's important for the narrative to be changed almost immediately. How do you do that? You do that by getting access to the media. But in order to get access to the media, oftentimes you have to be connected to either the right organizing group, or the particular families that have been through it and have contacts with the media. Very seldom do we have genuine investigative reporters that just are going to use their mind, right? Like, oh, this doesn't sound right. Let me dig into this a little bit more. They're just typically going with what the police officers say. Why? Because they want to keep that relationship so that when they want a story, they have access to them. That's just that's the bottom line. But being that support for the families, however that looks, because it does look different, for different families. I've encountered some families that they just don't want to be bothered. It's where they are. And in those instances, I give them the information, and I let them know. I let every single family know, I'm not going to crowd your space. That is not me.
Right.
But I will give you my number, and whenever you need me, I'm here. You got a question, if I don't have an answer, I will do my due diligence to research that thing, to find that answer, and get them connected with whomever, whomever they need to be connected to. But it's just very important for us to let them know what it is that they're getting ready to face. No matter how egregious the video is that we seen, the bottom line is the system is going to operate as it always has. And we are in the space to make those kind of differences and those kind of changes. And one other thing that I wanted to say with the qualified immunity, I did a TED talk about, that was one of the topics that I talked about in the TED talk. And in doing the research, I realized that qualified immunity actually originated as a protection to the Black community. And there was judges that changed the trajectory of what qualified immunity looked like for our communities. And because of that flip, that has, like you said, John, been one of the biggest barriers, be it criminally or civilly, for us being able to get accountability in these type of situations, in these murders, in the acts of stealing our children. Qualified immunity that's like their cornerstone of freedom for these police officers.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk with both of you and to know that, to feel your all's commitment to the long haul and to the transformational or systemic changes that are needed. I'm going to just say one word about, we're going to have another dialogue at 7 p.m. tonight, and then we'll be here Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, 12 noon and 7 p.m. That's Central Time. And you can go to Mothers Against Police Brutality's Facebook page, and there's a link there for anyone who wants to watch it. And I guess we've got about a minute left, and I'm going to ask Pastor Holmes to take us out. And it's good to be with you all. Good to see you, Adrienne. And Pastor Holmes, will you go ahead and close us out? Thank you.
And thank you, Pastor Holmes. I really appreciate you.
You already know I love you to life. You already know. Let's pray. God, our creator, God, our conqueror, God, our comforter, we come to you in this moment, knowing that you are not only a God of grace and mercy, but a God of justice and of righteousness. We ask now, Lord, that you strengthen these who are committed to doing what your word says, building on earth as it is in heaven. God, keep our feet to the fire. God, keep our hand to the plow. God, help us for the tough times ahead, to reminder that greater is the spirit that is in us than the spirit of injustice that comes against us. God bless everyone here till we meet again and until victory is won. I pray it now in my tradition in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thanks everybody that tuned in, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone.